Yeah. Seems like every other podcast that we do these days, we're mentioning um, the passing of someone involved. That's too bad. 2016, man.
Well, no, yeah, 2016 in general, 2016's been a rough year, but
Yep. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, comic or not just comic book canon, but the idea of canon in general. So canon, and you can kind of blame the biblical context for this, but this is basically the grouping of acceptable or yeah, I guess acceptable is probably the best word, like books, films, comics, etc., that make up a in this case like a fictional universe or something like that. Star Wars is one of the prime examples, I think, of what is canon, what's not. Star Wars was notorious for having different levels of canon based on the source material. But in general, like, we as geeks really latch on to canon, and I was kind of curious what you guys think of as the reason behind that, and how much does canon actually matter to you guys?
You would have to tell me, are you talking about canon as defined by the creator of the work, the producer of the work, or do you think that there's also a personal canon that you can have? They call it head canon in social media.
Well, that's part of the question, right? I mean,
Hmm.
how do you define canon? Like, what is it? What does it mean to you?
I think that canon is based on the fact that all of these properties are art. So canon is up to the viewer. I mean, just like any piece of art is judged entirely by its reception, I would say the same thing is true for any type of property. So whether this is comics, whether we're talking about J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and Hogwarts and that whole world, whether we're talking about Star Wars, whether we're talking about Star Trek, it's up to the individual viewer to judge that work and to decide for themselves what they want to suspend disbelief to accept.
So I think first thing you have to do is you have to define canon for yourself, right? And the way I've always understood canon is not just in a literary sense of like what's part of, say the literature of American canon, right? It's what's true in a story, what actually happened. And it gets really murky the further and further out you get from sources of art that have one creative mind behind them. Like, I don't remember who said it. It might have been Faulkner or something like that. Or I'm just going to say it was Faulkner so I can sound smart. That writing a novel is the ultimate form of artistic expression because it is the work of a single mind. Whereas a comic book or a movie or a television show are a collaboration of multiple minds and multiple creativities working at the same time. So, like, for instance, I have this kind of pet theory about canon in a literary sense, at least. It borrows more from literature, is that once you escape the original creator's work, you are by definition non-canonical. Now, the fans may or may not accept the work as part of the character's story or the universe's story, but as far as I'm concerned, you're non-canonical. So here, let's just two examples, right? And it's all from literature. Conan and James Bond, right? They had an original author who wrote a series of stories about this one character in their universe that they defined fairly clearly. Fleming had like 13 Bond novels, and there was a collection of Conan shorts and novellas and actually like one novel, right? But as we know, Bond has novels written not written by Fleming.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Roy Thomas Conan comic book series. There's the Dark Horse comic book series. There's the series of Conan novels that were written by different authors. Robert Jordan wrote a series of Conan novels. So there's these different canons. So they're interesting Conan stories, but as far as I am concerned as a fan, Conan is what was written by Robert E. Howard, and everything else is just a retelling. Now, things get murky when you split off into things like comic books and movies. So, like, if you look at Batman and Superman, here's a great example of canon just being blasted all over the wall. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine about Batman.
Canon blasted. I like it.
Yeah. I was going. Yeah. So we talk about Batman's been around since what? 39, 38, 37, something like that.
39, I believe.
39. So he's been around 70, 80 years. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a big Batman fan. Every Batman story and every interpretation of that character and his ancillary characters has basically been told. They all can't be true at the same time. So we as fans have taken upon ourselves which ones are the most popular. And there's a reason for that because, talking biblically, that's kind of how the canon of the Bible got picked up, right?
Exactly,
it was
right.
What was being preached in different cities or in the Christian world kind of came together, right? And some just
and then they had a huge council.
Right.
Everybody got in one place and was like, okay, this is what we're going with.
Right. So there are stories, ancient stories that were just in the Christian canon that just weren't used anymore. And in some other religions picked them up and adapted them, and others were codified in the Bible. We do the same thing with superheroes. A really good example of this is Superman. And if you watch Max Landis's video where he pitches a Superman story, and it's just beginning to, it's about a 45-minute pitch, but I like watching the guy talk. He's eccentric, but
That's
he
an
basically,
understatement.
yeah, right. He gives you his story, which is just a retelling of other Superman canonical stories. So he knows what fans, Doomsday is Superman canon. Zod is Superman canon. These are all things that are, yet they were never written by the original creators.
Yeah.
But they are accepted as the mythos of Superman. And there's other stuff that's just thrown away. There's other stuff that is Superman we don't even bother with, like Red Sun, or the one where Superman lands in Mexico. And it's the same thing with Batman. There's Batman stories that are told that we just don't even bother with. There was, it was in the 60s or 70s, there were two guys writing Batman at the same time. There was a kid's Batman, and then there was a more adult Batman. And it was which one's the real one? Right? It's eventually just what's more popular gets absorbed into the canon. What gets even more difficult is when you go into things like Star Trek and Star Wars, where this was never truly the work of a single mind. You had Roddenberry and Lucas who started, but if you go look at the Star Wars films, there were other dudes writing Return of the Jedi and Empire Strikes Back. He just was story credited. And Roddenberry had a team of television writers. I mean, some of the best Star Trek episodes, OTS episodes, were written by sci-fi authors, right? And they're just considered canon because they were in the show. And then you've got novels and video games, and did what happened in novels really happen in that universe? Did what happened in video games really happen in that universe? Those are just non-canonical stories that get thrown in there, but if they become popular enough, like a good example is Grand Admiral Thrawn in Star Wars. Here's a character that got thrown in a novelized version post Return of the Jedi, appears in a number of video games, and now I hear he's appeared in Star Wars Rebels.
True statement.
So here's a character that wasn't created by Lucas or any of the television or, movie writers, inserted via novel, became popular enough that he appears in video games and other comic books, and now if Star Wars Rebels is considered Disney canon, Grand Admiral Thrawn's real.
Yeah.
Right? There's no... There's,
well,
there's,
and then there you go again.
Here.
You've got another corporation coming in and purchasing a property, and suddenly they decide that they're going to pick and choose what is canon and what isn't canon based out of what is already in existence. What happens if you're a fan and you're coming into it after the fact and you're like, hey, you're in, I don't know, Goodwill, and you pick up a used paperback and you're like, hey, this says Star Wars.
You should
is
probably
that canon?
You should probably put it down because it's in Goodwill and God only knows where it's been.
Good, very excellent point. But what I'd really like to do, dude, because when I was thinking about this topic this week, I came up with two examples that I think, if we kind of rewind back to your literary and single author idea, may either make you revise that or at least think about it a little bit more. One of them is, what happens when the original creator, the single creator of a property, changes the canon or expounds on the canon after the fact? For instance, J.K. Rowling going back after the fact and saying, I really wish that I had made Harry Potter get with Hermione because now I regret that she was with Ron. Or Dumbledore was actually gay. I always thought he was gay. I didn't bother to write that, but I always thought that in my head. So now that's canon. What about that? Single author.
Right. Well, I knew you were going to Rowling the second you brought this up, right? Because it's just we've talked about it before. Is that Rowling appears to be creative by committee, right? It's almost that what direction her fans want her to go is the direction she goes. And I'm not a big Rowling fan. The reason why I brought up Fleming and Howard is because I'm familiar with their works. But you know, if the reason why I stuck with the single creator Faulkner model, right, is just because it's the easiest one to work with, right? It gives you that clear line, because with those later examples I gave you, you could see how blurry everything gets.
Yeah.
It's almost immediately, once you go outside a single creative mind, just it's a mess. So with Rowling, she does kind of throw a wrench into this, but at least if I were to be consistent in the model, is whatever Rowling says goes. So Rowling we have this phrase now, retcon, and it's just now it's so ensconced in the popular vernacular because it's being used so often. Just think of the X-Men movies and that Logan trailer, Easter eggs and things I sent you from Mr. Sunday Movies.
Yep.
He talks about how the timeline just makes no sense at all. Like the X-Men timeline just literally makes no sense. So on the one hand, we have to admit that these creators can't put all the thought into it that fans, many thousands of fans do at the same time. It's just the man hours that go into that are just, the disparity is huge, right? George R. Martin can sit there and spend how many hundred of man hours writing something and thinking about it, but then 10,000 fans can each put in.
And they're going to poke so many holes in it and say, oh, well, I saw this and I saw that. You said his eyes were gray in this book, and the next book you said they were blue. What is it? What really is it?
And I think he talked about it in an interview. He goes, now, all right, well, they're blue-gray now. Right? So the blue, he corrected that, you know?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at, is that, so where is a fan left with, right? So as a fan, I see them all as different canons. The Howard canon for Conan is the canon, right? That's it. That is all. If you want Conan, the books of Robert and the short stories of Robert E. Howard, you need not go any further. If you want different and Andrew and I were when we were at PhoenixCon, I asked this question of some of the guys who wrote characters of Burroughs, from Burroughs, right? Wrote stories of characters from Edgar Rice Burroughs. How do you do that? The guy's dead, and so how do you tell these stories of these characters that aren't yours, right? And so you don't know what that author would think about. And one of the guys, I forgot the dude that was there, because a bunch of them had written Burroughs stories.
Yep.
The older gentleman, I forgot the guy's name, who was there, said the key is you got to stay true to the spirit of the original intent. You've got to keep that spirit. You've got to define what this is, and then stay in those parameters. Because the second you start to add your own politics, for lack of a better word, and you go beyond those parameters, you lose what that character is. So, like, a good example is a James Bond. Right? James Bond is a totally un-PC character in the 21st century.
Yep.
So if you go beyond the parameters that Fleming set for that character, you know, how he defined what that personality is, what those stories were, what that character does, you expand it to the point where, as a fan, if you accept the, you know, upper threshold of Bond as your character, then you can, and you could create that and you lose what you're talking about, because you've taken that, let's say, upper bandwidth tolerance of what you think Bond is, so you then create back on that, you've created another, you know, tolerance for what that character is. So now it's like a game of telephone, right?
It's not even just that. I mean, I've read people doing additional novels about Heathcliff from the which Bronte, the younger Emily Bronte. I've read like Jane Austen novels supposedly where they take characters from Jane Austen and they just keep reworking them, and I'm going, you can't. Especially 200 years.
But... Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is you could do anything.
But it's just crazy to me. 100 years after this person's death, you're going to take their character and you're going to somehow try to tell everyone that what you're writing is just as equally valid as the original. Maybe they don't think that. Maybe they do. But here's another example by someone who's a little bit more renowned. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote the story of Beren and Luthien. Beren being a man, Luthien being an elvish woman who fell in love with him and gave up her immortality to be with him forever. It's sort of an ancient mirror to the story of Aragorn and Arwen in the Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien told this story 4 different times in the existing, shall we say, canon. He told it in Aragorn actually tells the story to the hobbits on their way to the Last Lonely House. Somebody tell me what the Elvish is for that.
House of Elrond.
Thank you. So as they're headed there, Aragorn sits and he tells the hobbits this story. It's also reprised in a slightly different form in the appendices to the Lord of the Rings. Then it's also written in the Untold Tales, and the most recent writing that had been published during Tolkien's life, or actually the Untold Tales, I think, were published immediately after his death. It was written in the Silmarillion. So this story exists in 4 slightly different forms in the existing published works. They're republishing it all by itself, based on his notes, based on his stories, and under the auspices and care of his son Christopher. It's being published for the 5th time. This is the same author. He wrote this in 4 different forms, all of which were published with his go-ahead, and now it will be published one more time, even differently, a 5th time under his son's okay. What does that do to the canon?
You tell me. That's the thing, is where do we... There's no line here, right? I mean, this is a lot like the fair use conversation we had a few episodes ago. Is that the reason why we have these conversations is because art and literature and comic books, movies, they're so blurry at the margins.
Yeah.
You get stuff like this, and it's what you and I actually have no say over this, right? It's what the fans as a group accept. But that's
but I don't agree with that. I don't
think we have a choice, right?
I think it has to be at the personal level. I think the only way you can possibly define canon is to take it down to the personal level. I don't think it can be the collective. Otherwise, again, where do you draw the line? Like what's the number of fans that it requires to make this canon or not canon? When is Dumbledore actually gay?
6,000.
When the fans say so? Huh?
6,000.
No, 9,000!
Yeah.
No,
9,842. I'm just going to start throwing out random numbers.
Yeah, I just think in order to have a definition, it has to be the personal level because it's art. Because you're looking at it and you're deciding.
Right, so I understand where you're going with this, but here's I think what you got to go one step further, right? So
Okay.
I can grant you that it's at the personal level. This actually just doesn't embarrass my position, because if it is at the personal level and you've got 10,000 fans all accepting canon and they independently agree on the personal level that I had a good example is that Doomsday is now canon in Superman.
Okay.
It now becomes canon, right? I think it necessitates a community.
But what happens to that 10,000 in first person that goes, Doomsday is stupid. He never existed before now, and I don't want him to. For me, it's not canon. What about that guy?
Well, you're basically talking about me, right? And from my perspective,
I wasn't going to name you, but yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
And I'll tell you exactly what happens to that person is the other 10,000 tell, shut the fuck up, you don't know what you're talking about, and ignore them. That's exactly what happens. Okay, that's what that is.
The man speaks from personal experience.
Right. So with the Star Wars is a good example. Is J.J. Abrams came in and said, new canon, right? And I have a J.J. Abrams universe, and I'm just going to do whatever. The next director could come in and go, Abrams' stuff was stupid, because it is. That's not canon anymore. They can retcon it or just plain ignore it and move on with the Star Wars Prime universe and say, you know what? Romulus never blew up. That was a different universe. They can techno-babble their way out of it because it's Star Trek, and we could move on.
You just switched, you just switched from Star Wars to Star Trek in the middle there.
You did. I mean, it's the same guy.
It's
the same guy.
Well, yeah, that's what the problem lies.
Right. So no, it's because I'm talking about Star Trek, right? So
yes, but once again, J.J. Abrams' root cause number 1.
Always, right? Just See the new South Park episode.
But you're
please.
also you're seeing exactly what has happened now to Marvel. You know, like
Yes.
oh
I mean,
well
comic
now
book business
Iceman's
is bad.
gay.
Well,
Like,
so
what?
comic books I think are an even more
Surprise! I like dick.
comic books I think are an even more egregious form of canon. So, frequently that doesn't even get to referred to as canon. It's continuity in comics, right?
Yep.
And we
That's an interesting distinction. I wonder if it's a distinction without a difference or not.
I don't think hugely that it is.
I wonder.
Except that I think, like you've discussed, like canon I think is driven by the fans. Continuity I feel like is more driven by the writers and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
realistically, I don't think there's a huge distinction there. And I think we talked about when canon changes, like geeks do, they get on the internet and they scream for a while. I mean, I remember when
Every time.
when Disney said all the expanded universe stuff is no longer canon for Star Wars. A lot of friends of mine kind of lost their shit. Even Kyle did, which is it's hard to
I
get.
remember that.
It's hard to get Kyle worked up over anything. And
I can do it.
I mean, we all can. It just takes a little while. Kyle can also get you worked up over things.
Oh
I was
yeah.
gonna say,
True.
Jude is the one that's willing to put in the effort.
This is true. But I can remember going up to Kyle and be like, "Look, it's not like Disney's requiring you, to go turn in your books for burning, and
Yeah, this is
line
not
line up for re-education. at least not yet.
Yikes.
I mean, it's Disney; they're getting there. I'm certain they're working on the technology as we speak.
Probably. You're gonna swipe your badge to get into Disney, or your armband to get into Disney World, and suddenly your brain will reset entirely.
Yeah, but like comics, I mean, comics do this on like a regular basis, and fans.
Time.
I mean, especially with as often as they do. I mean, you talk about a retcon. Retcon literally is short for retroactive continuity. It is a comic book based concept.
Reset.
Like
Yeah.
that's where the idea of a retcon comes from, is comics. They do this all the fucking time, and it never ceases to amaze me how much comic fans lose their minds over what they know is coming.
Yes. Well, with the Captain America thing most recently, where he said "Hail Hydra."
No, that's not even the worst. I mean, like, I think the worst lately was actually the DC Rebirth reboot.
Oh yeah, that was also a big one.
When they decided that, hey, the last 5 years of DC continuity are now not going to be canon, and we're going back to the old continuity, and like, just thinking about it makes me laugh because of how ridiculous it gets and how ridiculous the fans get. And I think, my biggest point is I don't really think continuity and canon really truly matters. I mean, like you guys have been arguing, make the decision for yourself, right? I mean, yeah, I think I can agree with both of you to some extent, especially Dude, when you're talking about, this is the author's work and this is everything else is just kind of other people doing their takes and expanding upon it. But, you hit a point where you're just going, who cares if they change it? What does it?
Well,
I
agree.
What does it matter?
No, I absolutely agree because, I think the truth lies in between all three of us, right? Is I pick the author, the original creative mind, just as a hard line, right? And once you cross that line, it's fuzzy, right? That's basically it. But as Tracy points out, probably the most important part is it's personal to the fan. All I would add to that is that where canon comes from first is the fans themselves, the group,
Certainly,
right? That's where it comes from. Now you're asking a little bit of a different question: is does it matter, right? And that goes back to kind of square one with Tracy. Is no, because it's personal. So for me, right, Bond is only what was written by Fleming, and written by and Conan is only written by Howard, and everything else is just kind of fun interpretations of that character that I can accept or reject without any real threat or embarrassment to the source product that I enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
So you could make Conan half elf. You could write a Conan story where Conan's a black half elf woman, demisexual, autistic person, And there's your Conan story, right? And it's like, okay, there's the Dark Horse stamp of seal approval. There's Conan, whatever, however they want to do it. That's not Conan to me. I don't have to accept it. And if enough fans don't accept it, it's forgotten.
Yeah,
right? It's forgotten. So you're right. It doesn't matter at all. So in the end, especially with comic books, people just take sections of these characters' histories and accept them as canon. So, like, for some people, the Spider-Man is the Spider-Man that was written by Todd McFarlane. That's their Spider-Man. It's Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. Or for other people, their X-Men is Chris Claremont's X-Men. Absent that fact that Stan Lee created the damn thing. So other people, it could be just Stan Lee is my X-Men plus maybe a couple parts from here and there. And that's the X-Men that I like. And
I would love to meet someone who thinks that about X-Men, because I've read Stan Lee X-Men.
Right. No, that's what I always
and
found really
I want to
funny.
know what medication they're on, because I want some of it.
I've always found that funny, because like we revere Stan Lee as this great creative mind. I've never read a single word of his, and I remember asking you this, like, is his shit even good?
It's pretty rough at times.
Yeah, so
the man loves himself some alliteration, though.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
and not even just in names.
Also transistors.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about that in some other stuff, and just
like transistors, like the little electronic stuff. Like,
yeah. So like in old Iron Man issues and Avengers, because Iron Man's in it, everything is transistor powered.
Oh.
Which I mean, that's a problem on a couple fronts. One is transistors don't power things. Right, they're basically little switches,
right.
or amplifiers. I've looked at, again, not being very good with electrical engineering, I've looked at like the schematic for an amplifier for transistors. I'm like, how the fuck does that work? I can understand how it works as a little switch, because that's that's as good as I'm going to get. But yeah, I mean the transistor thing, I think, is just Stan loving the idea of this new technology and wanting to incorporate it, because transistors actually are one of the most important inventions in the history of man, believe it or not.
Oh yeah, but I mean, more to the point, I think you're right. Is in the end, don't get too bent out of shape over it, because what you love about whatever piece of geekdom that you like. So for me, I like TIE Fighter. TIE Fighter is canon. I don't give a fuck what Disney says.
Right.
Game TIE Fighter is fucking awesome, and that's canon to me. That shit happened. All right, I single-handedly sunk an entire Rebel fleet with a missile boat.
Speaking of Grand Admiral Thrawn.
Yeah, right.
I actually think that's where he originated. But
the one thing that I have to point out is that this is a mature conversation for us to have. The points of view that we're taking are mature, because, and I say this because
we're not
this
screaming at each other.
Yeah,
no. I don't.
Like Tracy just saying, "Good for you. You could talk like an adult."
I'm not
We're not
referring
screaming
to mature
and throwing
in that way.
feces.
No, that's monkey behavior, not.
Challenge accepted.
I don't mean mature in that way. I mean mature as in, I think it takes a lot of experience with these different properties and seeing what happens to really grasp what we're saying. Because I remember being 16, 17 years old. I don't even remember what I was reading. I was reading something. And the more recent works completely changed the earlier stuff. I mean, Redwall does this a little bit. People would take the characters from Chronicles of Narnia and they would write stuff. I would get bent out of shape over fan fiction, like Lord of the Rings fan fiction, because it wouldn't match my expectations, and then I'd get all upset that anyone could even think such a thing. And that's something that an immature mind will dwell on, whereas a mature person or someone who has sort of realized that these things do come and go, like what Dude was saying, these things come and go. If a majority of fans don't like it, it disappears and everyone forgets about it. But that's something that it takes a little bit of experience to actually grasp. I think that a younger fan isn't going to understand that fundamentally.
Maybe.
It was very beautiful. I wanted to believe it, but as Tracy's saying this, my head is going back to the dude we saw at New York Comic Con, going, "What they did to Green Lantern was a travesty." Like
right.
That wasn't a younger fan. That was a man. That was a grown man losing his bananas.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the other definition of mature, the not throwing poop at one another definition of mature, I think is actually the one you really were kind of going for there, because there are plenty of people who have read every issue of every comic published since 20 years before they were born, and know all kinds of stuff and just can't accept any change, and any deviation from what they deem as their own canon.
I'm very sad to hear that those people exist. Perhaps I just have not been exposed properly to those people.
You obviously have not just been paying attention while we were walking around New York Comic Con. They were all over the place.
I just try to ignore those ones. Although I did see someone kind of standing off to the corner
Tracy's
today.
Determining her own canon of reality now. Is that what's happening?
Entirely possible.
I'm not saying this is a bad idea. I'm not saying this is a bad idea. I'm just we'll have to look into that one. Tracy's reality canon.